Okay, so Timothy and Silas were coming to him from Corinth, and we talked about how that they um, they came to him. They came to him in Athens, and then Paul sent them, at least Timothy, back, and Silas could have gone somewhere else, but back to Thessalonica. And then Paul went from Athens to Corinth. And evidently he told Timothy, I'm going to Corinth. And so whenever Timothy got through, or at least he came and Timothy came back through Athens and was asking where Paul was, and they told him he was in Corinth, but somehow he knew. So he went to Corinth. Is ministering there. This is in chapter 18. And you remember how that Paul was there in Athens by himself for a while, but then he received word. He's also then waiting for them. But when he's waiting for them to return in chapter 18, he doesn't just waste his time. He's preaching and teaching. And we also see that he's working with his hands. He's building tents because this is what he's making tents, because this is part of his trade, how he supported himself. And this is also how Priscilla and Aquila were involved with Paul, and they helped each other out evidently. And so while he's waiting on them to return, he is teaching and preaching. And it says in verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So he's very busy. And then when you look in verse 5, it says, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Okay, so in verse 4, what was he doing? Yeah, and who's he teaching? Yeah, so it'd be everyone, right? Everyone that was there. All right, and then what is he doing in verse 5? The same thing, right? So look at what it says, though. It's interesting how it lays it out. I believe every word in the Bible was there because God intended it to be there, and it gives us an insight. What's the difference between verse 4 and verse 5? Why would he say he taught, and then when Timothy got there, he taught again? What's the difference between those two actions from what it says there? Does your translation have anything different from what mine said? Okay, that's good. What else does it say about his motivation? So in verse 4, we have to presume his motivation. What was his reason for teaching and preaching in the synagogue? It's the same one as always, right? But in verse 5, it says that he was compelled. Mine says compelled. Does yours say compelled? In verse 5? That Paul was occupied. Mine says that Paul was compelled by the Spirit. Wholly absorbed. There's a difference here in the two phrases, in the two sentences here. Let me find here. I've got a footnote. Let me see. It probably says that this is disputed. It says, or in his spirit or in the Spirit. This is what he did. So the King James translates that he was compelled by the Spirit. Right. So he was teaching in the Spirit before, but now he's compelled in the Spirit. Is the idea. Pressed. Okay. Yeah. So there's some emphasis there, right? So the only thing has changed is what? Well, I mean, between verse 4 and verse 5. His motivation, what changed that? There's an interesting situation that's here in verse 5 that's not in verse 4. Silas and Timothy arrived. That's the only difference. He taught the same message. He was still same motivated, but now he has Timothy and Silas arrived. Where was Timothy before? Remember? He was sent back to where? Thessalonica. Why was he sent to Thessalonica? That's true. That's true. Okay, so I think it is still emphasizing that he was in the synagogues doing that. Why was Timothy in Thessalonica? Nope. Let's look in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 18. I'm not asking this as if I would assume this is common knowledge. I'm leading up to the idea here. He says in verse 18, we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us. Okay. What was that about? You remember? Most likely, at least, this was when Jason and his household were arrested. Remember, they arrested Jason and his household, and they basically put him on bail, and they charged him a sum of money. And the intention was, if Paul comes back and causes any more problems, we're going to keep that money. And so this was a burden to him. And he says here, we wanted to come to you, especially he's saying, I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us. And there's no telling what that means, but a lot of people have surmised that that's probably related to Jason being arrested, that kind of thing. Whatever it is, it's something that's hindering him from going. But if you look in chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone. So Paul was left in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning the faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. So Paul is beside himself with concern and worry for the church in Thessalonica because of what he had just experienced. Remember, he just came out of Thessalonica. And it hasn't been long at all. He knew the reason he left Thessalonica to begin with was because of the persecution that they were starting to receive. So they ushered him out, and now all he's doing is he's so concerned for them. He says, we couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to stay in Athens, and we sent Timothy back to Thessalonica. What was he going to do in Thessalonica? To encourage, right? So that none of them would falter and fall away. And so in verse 5, he says, 1 Thessalonians 3:5, for this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you and our labor might be in vain. So what was he concerned about with that church? Yeah, because of the persecutions, he was really concerned that these people are going to fall away. They're new Christians, right? And how easy is it for Christians to fall away if they're new converts? Very easy. So he's very concerned, and so he sends Timothy. How do you think that if he's saying this, in fact, he says it in two different places, we could no longer endure it in verse 1 and verse 5, I could no longer endure it. How do you think he feels when Timothy's gone? Do you think he's relieved now that Timothy's gone? No way. It's probably worse. He's there by himself. He has no idea what's happening. That's why he sent Timothy back. And now he's just waiting. Do you think he was anticipating, looking forward to Timothy coming back? Absolutely. Okay, so when Timothy came back, he actually had good word because it says in verse 6, but now that Timothy has come to us from you and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always had good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us as we also see you. What was the report that Timothy gave Paul? Everything's fine, right? That's the difference in Acts chapter 18 between verse 4 and verse 5. We have Paul in verse 4 teaching and preaching in the synagogue to the Jews and Gentiles, and then they get word back from Timothy about the church in Thessalonica, how do you think he feels then? Now he's boosted in his confidence. He's not depressed or upset or stressed anymore about this. Wouldn't you imagine that he would feel relief? Sure. And then what does that do? What does that compel him to do? Preach. Do you think that the sermons from verse 5 were maybe a little bit stronger or a little bit more enthusiastic than the ones from verse 4? There's no doubt about that to me. And any of you who have spoken, if you've done public speaking at all, you don't want outside pressures, and you don't want the way you feel on the inside to reflect in the message. But does it happen? Yeah, it does. And I've had people come up to me sometimes, and they not here, but I've had people come up to me and pat me on the back and say, "You obviously are going through something really difficult." I said, "Man, I didn't want to show that." But it just comes out, right? But when you have good news, then you also see that too. So you can definitely tell a difference. When a speaker is feeling good and motivated, you can tell a difference. And Paul's just a human being, right? So that's really fascinating to me, that we get to see a little bit of insight in what Paul was and what he concerned himself with. All right, so we also can see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where I'm not going to spend very much time with this, but 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. If I can get there. Let's see here. He says, "From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and day I've been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches." Now, out of that list, which one does it seem like he's saying is probably the most pressing on him? The bottom one. The concern that he has daily, the pressure that he has out of all of his concern and worry and stress about the churches. That's pretty insightful. The other stuff, it just happens. But this is what he's concerned with, and his deep concern for all the churches. All right, so I think it's important for us to understand, what does this say about Paul? A lot, doesn't it? It says a lot about his character and about his concern. It wasn't that he went in and just got them told and went on to the next place. He had a deep love for these people that he preached to. It was obvious. All right. Now, let's consider that. Also look in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 25. And I want you to notice here, when he talks about the deep concern that he has for the churches back in 2 Corinthians, and in this passage, it's a different situation, but he says that he wants that there will be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care for one another. That word and the word Paul used to describe the way he felt in 2 Corinthians are the same word. That's what he wants for us, to have that kind of concern that he had. So it should be something that is pressing on us, weighing on us, and especially if the church is facing difficulties or problems, this is something that should concern us, right? So that's a really important idea. Also, Philippians chapter 2 and verse 20. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 20, he says, he's speaking of Timothy. He says in verse 19, "I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state." There's an indication that Paul's worried about them, and he's sending someone to take care of them. and he's going to learn about their state. And he says in verse 20, "For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state." The same word, it's the verb form, but it's the same word is used here as he told us to have concern for each other, and how the concern that he had for the churches. Those are all three the same idea. So that's important. And it's fascinating. Now, I could have used different words if he chose to. There were a lot of other words he could have used, but he used that word. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is because this comes up from time to time. Look over in Matthew chapter 6. Some of you may actually know exactly where I'm going with this. Chapter 6 and verse 34. Jesus says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." Does anyone want to hazard a guess what the word worry there in the original language is? Huh? Be full of cares, yes. But what is the original word? You know? You don't have to say the word. It's the exact same word we've already been talking about. The concern, the deep concern that Paul had, the deep concern that he wants us to have, the deep concern that he knew Timothy had. Jesus says, do not have that concern. So how do we reconcile that? It's a good question, isn't it? There's a big difference, isn't there? We have physical things in Matthew chapter 6 versus spiritual things, the things that are really important. I heard a man preach a sermon one time, a long time ago, and he got up and he was talking about worry, and he said, never sweat the small stuff. Rule number 1. Rule number 2, everything's small stuff. You know what? That's a lie. There are some things worth concerning yourself about. And if we're going to sit around and talk about it in that sense, then when Jesus was in the garden, did he sin? I mean, he's sweating like drops of blood. Was that sin? Was it worry? It's concern. It's translated worry in other passages. But yes, it is concern, and I believe there's a difference between worry and concern. I do believe that there's a difference, and most of it relates to whether or not it's habitual. I mean, because we can be worriers, we can just obsess with finding everything that we can find to worry about, and I think part of that is what Jesus is talking about too. But also, we can worry about things that don't really matter, right? Ultimately, the physical things don't matter nearly as much as the spiritual. And we need to concern ourselves with it. So there's been times where I felt guilty because, and I'm so thankful that I'm not doing that here. I'm not just saying that, by the way. I'm really, it's nice. I've been in places where my stomach was in knots for months out of the concern for what's happening. And it's not a pleasant place to be. And I felt terribly guilty about it. But then I had to realize that I think God may have concern as well. And so there are times we're going to be concerned. And it doesn't do us any good to worry and fret, but it also doesn't do any good to just dismiss everything and say, it's not worth worrying about. There are some things that are worth concerning yourself with, right? And so we have to keep a balance. Anyway, I just thought that we would bring that up. And Paul's reaction then, whenever he got news from Timothy, this is what a warrior would do. A warrior would be, Timothy, give me all the news. Timothy lays out everything. Everything's going great. And then he would a warrior would stay up all night the next night worrying about the stuff that Timothy missed. I mean, that would be introducing problems. That's certainly not what we should do. But it's pretty obvious that Paul was really concerned. And then how did he feel after he got the good news? Well, we don't know. It doesn't say, but we do have a little bit of an indication here in the text, right, that he was compelled by the Spirit, or he was compelled in his spirit, as some translate it. Whatever the case, it's pretty obvious that there's a change in his emotional state. And I think it's really interesting to see that kind of stuff. All right. Let's see here. When they rejected Paul in the synagogue, coming back to Acts chapter 18. Well, let's read ahead a little bit. The question is, what did he do and why? But we read this last week. Let's go ahead and just read a little bit more here. In verse 6, when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. So what did he do and why did he do it? Why did he do this? What does it mean to shake his garments? It's a sign of being done, right? And what is that literally what he did? What did he actually do? Yeah, it's actually an activity that they would do. They would just take their garments and just shake it like that because they don't even want the dust of that place on them. All right, and it means I'm done, and it really implies what he says here. Your blood be upon your own heads. I'm clean. What does he mean by that? He tried. Yes. And they wouldn't hear it. Can you think of where that might come from? It's an Old Testament passage. Shaking the dust off your feet. Well, yeah, Jesus told him to do that. This actually comes, now, not shaking the garment. I don't mean that. I mean this idea of saying, I'm done, your blood be upon your own head. Where does the blood be upon your own head idea come from? You don't even have to have the passage. Just, you know what it says? Ezekiel 33. This is the messenger. Remember how God told him, if you go and speak to the people, then they reject it. You've done your part, and the raiders may come in and destroy them, and you're not guilty at all. But if you refuse to tell the message, the spokesman refuses to tell the message, and the raiders come in and destroy them, who's going to be guilty of it? The guilt would fall on the messenger because he didn't do his job. The watchman, yeah. So what Paul is saying is, I did my job. God told me, I warned you, and now you're going to be destroyed, and it's not my fault. Yeah, so people are self-condemned because of the things that they teach. Yeah, in that passage. What word was that? Titus chapter 3. So that's what's going on here, and that's the reason he tells them that. And the idea, this is a Jewish custom of, wiping the feet off, or dusting their feet, or shaking their cloak off, or in this case the robe, so that all the dust is gone. They don't want anything to do with them anymore, is the idea. So now he's going to go to the Gentiles, right? Did he go to the Gentiles from then on? No, he's just talking about in that city. That's where he did it. But he spent a lot of time here, didn't he? At first he was teaching in the synagogues, and now he's going to actually open up other avenues and start teaching. So in verse 7, he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. So obviously he didn't completely reject the Jews. He just didn't teach them anymore. And if they came around, he would teach them, evidently. The Lord spoke to Paul in verse 9, in the night by vision. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. All right. Now, here's an interesting situation that he's telling him to not be afraid, but to speak and not to keep silent. And he says, because I have many people in this city. Was that a reference to people who are Christians or not Christians, or both? Doesn't say. If it was talking about people who are not Christians, what would it mean? There you go. There are people here who need to hear the gospel. That's why he told him to stay and teach. I have many people here. That doesn't mean that they're all in a right relationship with God at the time, but it could be he's talking about there are a lot of people here that need to hear the message. And what is he? In fact, he says, I'll protect you, right? Have you heard any place where God has told Paul any other time, you stay there and I'll protect you? That's the first time it's ever been said. And so this is a very important place for him to be. And this is actually where he's going to start writing letters. The First and Second Thessalonians were definitely written from here. At least First Thessalonians was definitely written from here. But also probably the book of Galatians was written here, if not earlier. But this is an important time. And it could be that First and Second Corinthians would have been written later, but there may be other passages, other books that were written here. Galatians. First and Second Timothy weren't. Not Titus. Maybe Philemon. I'd have to look into that. Anyway, this is the beginning of his writing. And why would he start writing letters here? Because he had time. He's there a long time. A year and 6 months isn't long, I know, but it is for him. So he's starting to teach. There's also another thing. I'm not a Greek scholar. The only reason I'm bringing up these Greek words is because these have been pointed out to me. In verse 11, it says he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. The word teaching here is a new word that's describing his work. This word has never been used to describe Paul's teaching and preaching before. It started here. So what might account for this difference in this word? Can you imagine why there would be a difference? Good observation. Yeah, so he has to change his tactics a little bit because he's not going to be in the synagogue anymore, and he's now teaching other people besides the Jews. Now, like you said, the Jews would come around, and evidently they would, and he would teach them, but he's a different tactic, okay? That's definitely one of the ideas. Now he has a little bit longer time in this because God told him he's going to stay there for a while too. If you have a longer time frame, would you teach differently than if you know you're going to be there a short amount of time? What would be the difference? More formalized, that could be it, yeah. If he's not dealing with the Jews, that's right, he can deal with a whole lot of other materials. Very good, excellent thoughts. What about when Jesus said to go out and teach the gospel? And he said, go into all the world and teach the gospel to all the nations. I get those mixed up. Make disciples of all the nations. And he told us how to do that. Baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit and teaching them to observe all things. Okay. You have to teach to baptize. And you have to teach the rest of it, right? So now it seems like Paul is in a place where he doesn't have to just teach how to be baptized. He also can teach them a whole lot of other things too. And so that could be a reference to the fact that he's becoming more and more of a teacher. The word here for teacher is didaskalos, which means it's the word that you would assign to a teacher in a classroom. And it's different than someone who would be just someone who's teaching someone something. All right, I don't really know the difference in the Greek, but I do know that the idea of this this is where we get the word didactic from. This is where we get didactic teaching, is that it's lecturing, and it's based upon a program of, we have a goal, we're trying to achieve this goal. And like for a teacher, they may set out a plan for a 6-month plan to teach a certain, that evidently is what's going on here. He has a plan and he's putting it into practice. So he shifts gears and he settles into a work. And there's a difference between, for example, with my preaching. If I'm here and I'm preaching or even teaching class, I approach it very differently than if I was put into, someone invited me to speak at some kind of a school event, and I got one shot. I'm going to approach that very differently than I'm approaching it here. There are things that I might say that I wouldn't say all in one time, because here I have the luxury, quote unquote, of being able to introduce ideas and build on them so that I can, over time, build a case for some particular idea. And I think that's pretty much what we're seeing here. So that's one of the reasons that I approach my preaching and teaching here differently than I would somewhere else. All right, any comments or questions so far? Yeah, I think it does relate to that, casting your pearls before swine. Yeah, I think that's the way you have to understand that passage. Yeah, thank you. And that relates to a lot more than just the Jews, but yeah, that is something to consider for that. All right, so verse 12, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters." And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. This is an interesting passage, too, because what was their tactic here to get Paul out of the city? They're taking it to the courts. And did they do that before? Yeah. Remember in Thessalonica, that's why Jason and his house were arrested. So they're starting to pick up on an idea here, but it kind of backfired on this one, didn't it? Because he didn't want to hear their little squabbles between their little, they saw it all as one religious thing. They saw the Christianity and Judaism as the same thing, and they're just arguing. I don't want to have anything to do with this. And then they took Sosthenes and beat him before the judgment seat, but Gallio didn't pay any attention. That's pretty interesting, and that's what they were hoping would happen to Paul, but it actually turned out happening to him. All right, so Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him, and he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, "I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing." And he sailed from Ephesus, and when he landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. And after he spent some time there, he departed and went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order strengthening all the disciples. So a lot of things happening here. But look at verse 18. This is where a lot of discussion has come up. Who is the one who took the vow and had his hair cut off? And why would he need to shave it? Also, we know it's a he. There's two possibilities, right? Two possibilities. One is Paul. The other one is who? Aquila. Right. Both men, so they'd be called he. And from looking at the context, which one from verses 18 and 19, which one is it most likely talking about? Paul. Yeah. From looking at the antecedents, if you look at Priscilla, okay, generally speaking with antecedents, and that is we have the word he. If you're trying to figure out who it's talking about, you look behind it, the sentence before, the last noun that's used to is usually what is meant for he. It's the last one, which in this case, it would be Aquila. Unless you include the him. Yes. So it's a little bit complex. Some people say it's Aquila. I believe it's talking about Paul because of the next verse. And he came to Ephesus and left them there. Who did he leave there? Priscilla and Aquila. So the only one that's left is Paul. All right. Now, it's not really that big of an issue. But the reason I'm asking this is because why would he have his head shaved? Jewish tradition. Well, no, the Nazirite vow, you don't cut your hair until a certain point in time, and then you cut the hair, and you know what you do with it? You burn it as a sacrifice. All right, so this is an interesting passage. Look over in Numbers chapter 6. This shows you the difficulties of the Jew-Gentile relationship and the Jews coming out of the law and what they are supposed to keep and what they're not supposed to keep, that kind of thing. And it's going to come up again, but Numbers chapter 6 and verse 13 said, "This is the law of the Nazirite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall be brought to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He shall present his offering to the Lord, one male lamb in its first year without blemish as a burnt offering, one ewe lamb in its first year without blemish as a sin offering, one ram without blemish as a peace offering, a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, and their grain offering and their drink offerings. The priest shall bring them before the Lord and offer his sin offering and his burnt offering, and he shall offer the ram as a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord with a basket of unleavened bread. The priest shall also offer its grain offering and its drink offering." We don't know exactly what the Nazirite vow was exactly, but let's keep reading because we're going to go down to verse 21. The Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, shall take the hair from his consecrated head and put on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. And the priest shall take the boiled shoulder of the ram, one unleavened cake from the basket, one unleavened wafer, and put them on the hands of the Nazirites. And he has shaved, after he has shaved his consecrated hair, the priest shall wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. They are holy for the priest, together with the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering. After that, the Nazirite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazirite, who vows to the Lord the offering for his separation. And besides that, whatever else his hand is able to provide, according to the vow which he takes, so he must do according to the law of his separation. Okay, sorry, I know it's a lot of reading, but we see everything there. This is pretty much what the Bible says about the Nazirite law. Do you know anyone in the scriptures who followed it? Samson. Yeah, and he was from birth. Right? That was a commanded. He didn't take the vow, but it was vowed toward him. No, he didn't follow it completely. No, that's for sure. So we don't know. The vow was just a vow that you could make for whatever reason people make vows for. And this had specific design. And these people were actually revered because of their sacrifice that they made. So is this possible that what Paul did is a Nazirite vow? And why would you say? What are some of the problems with this if it's a Nazirite vow? What are some of the problems we see? Law of Moses. Yeah, there's some pretty big problems in here. Considering that, what are some of the bigger problems related to the law? Well, he could. Yeah. What about all the sacrifices? What were the sacrifices for? Half of them, or lots of sacrifices, weren't they? Half of them were called what? Sin offerings. So now we have an apostle who is following the law of Moses and offering sacrifices for his sins. Mm-hmm. No, that is related to ceremonially unclean. Yeah. Yeah, but that, regardless, if a man died ceremoniously unclean, he was outside of a relationship with God. He had to make a sin offering to be right with God again. He couldn't go to the temple without making it. And if he went there in order to make the sacrifice, that was different than just walking in, not wanting to make the sacrifice. So there's a definite problem with that. But there's a really big problem that shows me that this isn't a Nazareth vow. You know what it is? Where's Paul when all this is happening? Where did he make where did he cut his hair off at? Huh? Ephesus, right? General area there. Where did he have to be in order for that to be a Nazareth vow? In Jerusalem, in order to make sacrifices. You can't make a sacrifice at a synagogue. So that indicates that, now, I'm bringing that up because I've read commentaries that said Paul sinned here. He's making sacrifice of the Nazareth vow. That doesn't say that. It could have been anything. We have no idea what's going on. We just know that he made a vow and he cut his hair off. That may have been all there was to it. Have you ever made a promise? If I get out of this situation, then I'm going to do this. And then are you obligated to keep that when you get out of that situation? Yes. Most of the time we don't. But that's the obligation. We are to keep our vows. So Paul evidently said, okay, I'm gonna grow my hair out and I'm gonna make a sacrifice and I'm gonna cut it off. We can imagine him doing that. And is there anything wrong with that? No, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's just a matter of tradition for them. It was a custom, perhaps. So anyway, I know we chased that rabbit around all over the place, but it's fascinating that people will make arguments about text and they won't read everything that's related to it. Because when I first ran into this, I really had a hard time with this. And it wasn't until I went and actually read what the Nazareth vow said that I actually figured out what's going on. But I just assumed that I remembered it right. And because of that, I was thinking, man, this is a sin problem. Now, we're going to get into some more stuff later that's going to be a little hairier than this. But anyway, that's where we are. And we're going to be starting in question number 12 next week. Anybody have any comments or questions before we... Hairier, yeah. It's going to be... a similar what? Yeah, that's part of the problem we're going to be having to deal with. So it could be related to that. Yeah, we don't really know for sure, but the problem there is what he's told to do with that. But all right, well, thank y'all very much. We'll stop there.